website. Okay, you tune into the website, and what do you see? You see sketching. So instead of traditional question and answer, my hope was that, and if we could coerce him into doing it, that he would actually give us a little demonstration of drawing tonight. So I'm going to welcome him over.
I mentioned to Jen that in some occasions I have had these difficult high-tech situations in which I don't know how to hear words and I can be But yes, it is a very important thing that as architects we don't lose track of the management of what happens when you really don't have a linear process between each other. When you start drawing something, more often than not, you don't know where you're going to end up, which is one of the conditions that is so difficult to overcome in computer drawings. I was lucky enough to have a kid in the office that was from Moscow. He was, what's that? Difficult kid, but I mean, one of these complete geniuses. I mean, the guy landed in New York and he was 18 and came to the office and he said, you know, I just want to work. And I said, well, what do you know? What do you know? What about you, an architect? And said, no, I'm a college student, but I'm very fast with computers. And this guy dominated every single program in like a week and a half. He knew more than anybody else, right? So I became, which is something that happens to all of us, completely attached, a Siamese, to this kid, right? That drove me completely nuts and forced me to pay for his girlfriend to come from Moscow. And I was all kind of great, and one day he said, I mean, Mr. Viñoly, he called me, I mean, I want to go to engineering school. And I said, well, that's lovely, just go. And then he, of course, went, we paid for it. The guy became an engineer in something like 3 months or so and disappeared. But the best part of this experience was that one day he said to me, because I insist on the fact that you need to sketch, right? Nobody apparently knows anymore how to do that, which is really sad. And he said to me, because he was incredibly arrogant, he also said, you know, Mr. Viñoly, he said, I mean, I think that you talk too much about this hand drawing, but why don't you really learn how to draw with a computer? And you know, for a competitive person, this is like a challenge. So I went back, I took a week off, I locked myself into a room, and I learned every single program that was available. And this is only to say that the tools, in a way, are always responsible for most of what we do in a subconscious level. I happen to be very much enthralled by the human figure. And if you, this is sort of like a confession, right? So if you really look at, and it was simply because I always had difficulty in drawing it, so I forced myself to actually learn how to do it, right? And I constantly draw these images, which are, in my mind, you know, basically totally unrelated to anything. But if you really understand the nature of how one draws, I mean, this pattern of relationship between movements and form, I mean, when I started this thing, I didn't know whether I was drawing a man, a woman, or even a person or a face or anything. It just basically evolves. But most of what happens in architecture is that if you are reasonably sort of interested in the discovery of the thing, because, you know, we all understand our processes as being very, very rational, and we all know that in reality the rationality, and one of the very few things that as a professional you learn, is that you plaster the rationality after you came up with something, right? You know, I've seen you all go to final reviews and having to write what you thought at the beginning of the project, so you know you kind of make sense. But that process is important also in the generation of architectural forms. Say, for instance, this building that I just showed you, I mean, it's basically drawn in the same way in which I draw a person like this. So there is a certain facilities. I mean, if you remember Matthias Ungers, you know who he is, right? I mean, you guys know it because we're old, but I mean, maybe these people don't know it. You know, all his architecture was always a series of squares, right? And I had a person in the office once that had worked with him, and he had one of these things that I could never buy that are so wonderful, which, if you remember, I don't know what's the name in English, but there were these machines that had a roll here and that you could actually draw like an engineer like this, and you press a certain pedal here and this thing twisted up and down, and it was sort of like the illusion of the technology, right? So the guy had only this type of instrument in the office, and then no wonder that all the buildings were essentially just like that. So the problem is that when you really get into this sort of intimate dialogue with yourself, in which you really honestly have to admit that you don't know what you're doing, which is really a great step. I mean, you know, and if you have the honesty to say it, it's simply because you've gone through enough moments in which people have realized that you have no idea what you're doing and probably fire you. And in some other cases, you filter through and things happen by this dialogue between you, and it has nothing to do with creativity, it has to do with the input of the hand trying to recall something, right? So Fenchurch, for instance, is a building that is like this, right? That I can draw, 26 million times, and that actually was generated by a diagram like this. In other words, you start by looking at the pattern of the streets in London, and you have a river here, which is, the sine qua non of rivers, so urban rivers, that somehow just by doing something like this or generating the idea that you can actually, put a person looking down, right? So that there is a flexing of the building to actually respect the river somehow, right? That somehow this notion, right? So the notion of the building becoming an observer, and I'm almost embarrassed to say these things, but I know that they are somewhere behind all of this. So if you completely cancel the ability of dealing with this type of input, architecture and any kind of sort of creative work in which you are basically trying to invent something, which is another category conceptually that has been gravely sort of demoted, which is in reality we are practically the only field in all designers, I mean, in which you really your mission is to come up with something that didn't exist before. Even if you copy something, it did not exist before, and that relationship between an idea and the manifestation of it is completely fundamental. That's the reason why I think that in drawing form, which is something that I was this afternoon trying to solve a problem which I know that I had drawn completely in Rhino, which is something that is an extraordinary tool. I mean, I use it almost as sketching. I mean, I have been able to kind of master it in a way in which the rules, are not, I can punch dimensions and all that, but it is more like kind of schematic. But knowing that the building is a very simple building in a very difficult site, that has essentially two planes, one full of classrooms, and this one here that has 28 different classrooms, and the faculty members are located into the only this is controlled both in height and regulation by the city. And so the only thing I did was to say, which I still think that if I would have sketched this thing by hand, it would have been the same, because the offices are all with windows, right? So, and you count the perimeter of the site and double it because it's double loaded, and that's where the 620 offices fit, and there's no other way of doing it other than breaking this thing in three. But all of this is analysis on the geometric character of it. So it fits in here, it wouldn't fit in any other form, and the platform of classrooms, which is in here, has a plan which is very simple, that has a central area where the larger classrooms are, and then all the other classrooms are in the perimeter. So there is a skylight around this thing, there is a 500-seater in the center, there's a 250 and some other rooms in here, and this is what fits in the site, as long as you keep this notion that the horizontal distribution is better than the vertical one for interaction and ease of use. The problem that I had this afternoon is that I am convinced that unless I throw the computer somewhere and go back and do something with this stuff, which is in between, which is all the things that you would call designable, right? The library, the cafeteria, the, you know, all of these things. But these things cannot follow this geometry. They shouldn't follow this geometry because these two things are nothing other than planar planning spaces, right? So you create light and air around the central core, provide the amount of development for the office layout, and pack the classrooms underneath, and then you have to have a building here, right? And I didn't know how to do it until I basically left the computer next to in the desk that Glenn gave me and started drawing things that actually allow me to see that probably what I needed to do was to have some kind of asymmetrical. This is in South Carolina, and the the state tree is a palmetto, which is you know, a palm tree, right? And this thing in the center has a large atrium, large classroom in the center, in which I thought if this thing could come up and all of a sudden give you the presence of the palmetto lifted up from the floor, it could be an interesting game between the simplicity of this enormously long line and the fact that in this area you have this plane that needs to become a public plane. So if I try to design these things with a machine or with Matthias's table, I certainly won't be able to. It just you know, you need to now get this flexibility of what happens when you put pen to paper, which is conducted by two interrelated processes. One is experience, right? I mean, how to read your own scribbles, right? And the second one is the ability to let the hand move and do whatever it wants to do. So if you don't train the hand, I think that you lose a good 50% of the tools that you have to be able to generate images. I mean, I'm sure you've seen, you know, this type of sketches, which are Frank's, right? But I think that, and I must say that this is, you know, he couldn't even actually sort of imagine this kind of architecture if he wouldn't be so reliant on this, right? And there is no problem that I see with any of this. I mean, you probably remember some of the very striking sketches that Jörn Utzon did for the Sydney Opera House, right? So these are things that you cannot imagine being produced if they didn't have this type of input. My take on this is that if you can combine this thing with the computer, And if you can use them both at the same time, but with the same degree of freedom, that is to say, you have to use this thing not to verify, because the unbelievable virtue of this tool is that is precisely its own limitation, because you're completely constricted by this question of punching numbers in it, right? Now, if you create your own sense of scale, and if you work directly with a site which is built in the computer three-dimensionally, the time that it takes to make the adjustments that otherwise, as when I started, 35, 40 years ago, to go from here to a reliable plan in which I was convinced of dimensions, areas, and so on, it took an average of probably a month and a half, 2 months, and now you can do it in 5 minutes. And for people of my age, that's a good performance. Yeah.
Well, you not only packed the house, but you kept him here for nearly 2 hours.
Is that right? Sorry.
Thank you very much.